When the mushroom clouds rose over Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945, the world changed forever. And at the heart of that transformation was a single aircraft, the Boeing B-29 Superfortress. It was the most advanced bomber of its era, the most expensive, the most powerful. It had burned Japan's cities to ash, carried the atomic bomb, and helped force an empire to its knees. But when the war ended, America faced a question no one had expected to ask. What do you do with nearly 4,000 of the world's most sophisticated killing machines when the killing stops? The answer would reshape American air power, ignite a new conflict on the other side of the world, and quietly fade into legend, leaving behind a legacy most people never knew existed. This is the untold story of what really happened to America's B-29 Superfortress after World War II. The giant that won the war. To understand what happened after the war, you first need to understand what the B-29 represented. It wasn't just another bomber. It was a technological marvel, a machine so advanced that its development cost nearly as much as the Manhattan Project itself. Pressurized cabins allowed crews to fly at altitudes where enemy fighters struggled to reach them. Remote-controlled gun turrets, linked by an early analog computer, meant gunners could track targets with unprecedented precision. 4 massive Wright-R 3350 engines pushed the Superfortress to speeds exceeding 350 miles per hour, faster than many fighters of the early war, and its range, over 3,000 miles, meant it could strike deep into enemy territory and return home. In the Pacific, the B-29 became the instrument of Japan's destruction. From bases in the Marianas, wave after wave of superfortresses unleashed incendiary raids that turned Japanese cities into infernos. Tokyo, Osaka, Nagoya, Kobe. Hundreds of thousands died in the firestorms. Then came the final blow. On August 6, 1945, a lone B-29 named Enola Gay dropped a single bomb over Hiroshima. 3 days later, Bockscar did the same over Nagasaki. The war ended 6 days after that. The B-29 had become the sword that ended the most destructive conflict in human history. But victory brought an unexpected problem. America had built a fleet of nearly 4,000 B-29s. Factories were still churning them out when Japan surrendered. Thousands of aircrew had trained to fly them. Entire logistical networks existed to maintain them, and suddenly they had no enemy left to bomb. For a brief, strange moment, the Pentagon stared at the largest and most expensive bomber force ever assembled and asked, "What now?" The Great Purge. The answer came swiftly, and it was ruthless. Within months of Japan's surrender, America began dismantling its wartime bomber force with shocking speed. Production lines shut down almost overnight. Factories that had hummed with round-the-clock shifts fell silent. And the bombers themselves? Most were flown to vast desert storage facilities, places like Davis-Monthan Field in Arizona and Walnut Ridge in Arkansas, where they sat in endless rows under the scorching sun. Thousands of B-29s, wingtip to wingtip, as far as the eye could see. Crews stripped them of useful parts, engines, instruments, anything salvageable. Then came the scrapping. Workers attacked the aluminum airframes with cutting torches, reducing billion-dollar machines to piles of scrap metal. The aluminum was melted down and sold. Some of it became cookware. Some became car parts. The bombers that had incinerated cities were reborn as suburban American life. For the men who had flown them, it was surreal, almost insulting. One veteran recalled walking through a salvage yard in 1947 and seeing his old bomber, the one that had carried him through 30 missions over Japan, being chopped apart by teenagers with blowtorches. "It felt like watching an old friend die," he said. By 1948, over half of America's B-29 fleet had been scrapped or mothballed. The age of the superfortress, it seemed, was over. But fate had other plans. Because while America was busy dismantling its bomber force, tensions were rising on the other side of the world. And soon, those same B-29s, condemned to rust and ruin, would be called back into service for a war no one had expected. The Cold War rises. The victory celebrations had barely ended when a new threat emerged. The Soviet Union. America's wartime ally had become its greatest adversary, almost overnight. Joseph Stalin had no intention of relinquishing the territories his armies had seized in Eastern Europe. The Iron Curtain descended across the continent. And in Washington, military planners realized with growing alarm that the United States had dismantled its military too quickly. The atomic bomb had given America a temporary monopoly on ultimate power, but there was only one bomber capable of delivering it, the B-29. Suddenly, those desert boneyards didn't look like graveyards anymore. They looked like strategic reserves. The surviving B-29s, those that hadn't been scrapped, were pulled from storage, inspected, refurbished, and returned to active duty. New crews were trained, new squadrons formed, and the Strategic Air Command, or SAC, was born. Led by the uncompromising General Curtis LeMay, the same man who had orchestrated the firebombing of Japan, SAC became America's nuclear sword, and the B-29 was its blade. Throughout the late 1940s, B-29s stood on constant alert at air bases across the United States and around the world. If the Soviets moved, if war erupted in Europe, these bombers would launch with atomic payloads and strike deep into Soviet territory. For a few years, the B-29 held a unique place in history. It was the only aircraft capable of ending civilization. But even as it stood guard over the fragile peace, a new conflict was brewing. One that would call the superfortress back into combat. One last time. Thunder over Korea. On June 25, 1950, North Korean forces stormed across the 38th parallel. The Korean War had begun, and within days, B-29s were once again flying combat missions. But this was not World War II. The enemy had changed. North Korea fielded Soviet-supplied MiG-15 jet fighters, sleek, fast, and deadly. The B-29, designed to dominate the skies of 1945, suddenly found itself outmatched. MiGs could climb faster, fly higher, and attack with devastating speed. Early missions saw B-29 formations shredded by jet interceptors. On October 23, 1951, a daylight raid on Namsi Airfield turned into a massacre. MiG-15 swarmed the bombers, and 3 B-29s were shot down in minutes. The losses were so severe that SAC immediately halted all daylight missions. From then on, B-29s flew only at night, striking under cover of darkness to avoid the jets. Despite the danger, the superfortress proved invaluable. It pounded North Korean supply lines, bridges, and factories with relentless precision. It destroyed airfields before MiGs could even take off. And in the winter of 1950, when Chinese forces flooded into Korea and threatened to overrun United Nations troops, B-29s hammered their supply columns and slowed the advance. But the cost was high. Flak tore through aluminum fuselages, fighters stalked the night skies, and crews, many of whom had flown in World War II, found themselves back in the fight, older, wearier, but no less determined. One pilot described it as flying a relic into the future. The B-29 had been the king of the skies in 1945. By 1951, it was a survivor, clinging to relevance in a world that had moved beyond it. Korea would be its last war, but even as the bombers returned from their final missions, their story was far from over. Transformation and rebirth. When the Korean War ended in 1953, the B-29's combat days were finished. But retirement didn't mean extinction. Instead, the superfortress found new life in roles no one had imagined during the war. Some became aerial tankers. Stripped of their bombs and guns, they were fitted with hoses and fuel tanks, becoming the KB-29, America's first dedicated mid-air refueling aircraft. These tankers extended the range of jet fighters and bombers, enabling SAC's global reach. Others became weather reconnaissance planes, flying into hurricanes and typhoons to gather data that saved countless lives. Some were converted into rescue aircraft, their bomb bays filled with lifeboats and survival gear, ready to pluck downed pilots from the sea. A handful became test beds for experimental engines, radar systems, and weapons. One B-29, modified with massive turboprop engines, became the XB-44, a glimpse of the future of aviation. And then there were the drones. In one of the strangest twists of the Superfortress story, dozens of war-weary B-29s were converted into QB-29's remote-controlled drones. These ghost bombers were flown by radio, sent into atomic test sites to sample mushroom clouds, or used as targets for new air defense systems. They flew their final missions without a single soul aboard, piloted by invisible hands, sacrificed in the name of progress. It was a fitting, if eerie, end for machines that had once carried men into the most dangerous skies on Earth. But even as the last B-29s faded from military service, a few would be preserved, saved from the scrapyard, kept alive not as weapons, but as memories. Ghosts in museums. Today, fewer than 30 B-29 superfortresses remain in existence. Most are museum pieces, carefully restored and displayed as monuments to a bygone era. Enola Gay, the bomber that dropped the atomic bomb on Hiroshima, sits in the Smithsonian's National Air and Space Museum. Visitors stand beneath its wings in silence, confronted by the terrible weight of history. Bockscar, which bombed Nagasaki, rests at the National Museum of the United States Air Force in Dayton, Ohio. A handful of others are scattered across the country at the Strategic Air Command Museum in Nebraska, the Pima Air and Space Museum in Arizona, the Museum of Flight in Seattle. And then there's FIFI, the only B-29 still flying. Owned and operated by the Commemorative Air Force, Fifi tours the country, its engines roaring at air shows, reminding crowds of a time when these giants ruled the sky. When it flies overhead, low and thunderous, it's impossible not to feel the weight of what it represents. Not just a machine, but a memory of the men who flew them, of the cities they destroyed, of the war they helped end. For the veterans who gather at air shows to see FIFI, the sight is overwhelming. Some weep, some smile. Some simply stand in silence, lost in memories of missions flown 70 years ago. One veteran, interviewed in 2019, said it simply, "When I hear those engines, I'm 22 again, and I'm scared again, and I'm proud again." The lesson of the Superfortress. The story of the B-29 after World War II is not just about an aircraft. It's about transformation. About how a weapon of total war became a tool of Cold War deterrence, then a testbed for innovation, then a symbol of memory. It's about how quickly the tide of history turns. In 1945, the B-29 was invincible. By 1950, it was vulnerable. By 1960, it was obsolete. And today, it's a relic, a ghost that flies once a year to remind us of what once was. But the superfortress left a legacy far greater than its airframe. It pioneered pressurized flight, remote weapon systems, and long-range strategic bombing. It proved that air power could decide wars. It ushered in the atomic age. And it set the template for every strategic bomber that followed, from the B-52 to the B-2 Spirit. When we look at the B-29 today, we see more than aluminum and steel. We see the moment when warfare changed forever, when distance became meaningless, when cities could be erased in a single night, when the world learned that some weapons are too powerful to ever truly retire. The B-29 superfortress didn't just win a war, it redefined what winning meant. And in the decades that followed, even as it faded from the skies, its shadow remained, a reminder that some machines don't just make history, they become it. The B-29 superfortress carried the weight of a world at war, and then quietly faded into legend. But its story is just one chapter in the saga of the aircraft that shaped our skies. If you want to keep exploring the untold histories of the warbirds that changed everything, make sure you subscribe and let us know in the comments. Which forgotten aircraft story should we uncover next? Because every bomber, every fighter, every machine that ever took to the sky carries a story worth telling. And some of those stories have never been told.